It's the Believe in Texans podcast brought to you by FanDuel. And look, we as Texans fans, I myself as a former player know that the one huge hurdle that this team has not accomplished, aside from going to and winning a Super Bowl, is simply making it to an AFC Championship game. That's the thing that we cannot get out of our heads, the thing that we're reminded of by opposing fan bases all the time. So this offseason has been very much about, for me at least, saying, all right, look, they took this team. They saw what happened in New England last year. And above and beyond the play of C.J. Stroud, which we're always going to come back to until we don't have to, it's that can you make this team, which was really good in the regular season, more of a playoff football team? And they're really, really close. But I think some of the things they did in the offseason have me really encouraged, because it specifically addresses, all right, what do you have to do when you're on the road in bad weather in January and on into February, or to get to February? I think they addressed a lot of that. And I'm going to play a few clips here from some smart people about the Texans. And Leger Duzabla, who was on with Ross Tucker, basically said it. He said the floor for the Texans is the AFC Championship.
The floor for the Houston Texans should be the AFC Championship game. And that's saying a lot, because they've never been to an AFC Championship.
Which is crazy.
This is probably the best defense in football. I will say it's the best secondary in football. Them and Denver are neck and neck for the best defense in football. So the big question mark was the offense and the offensive line to C.J. Stroud. Well, I thought Nick Caserio, the GM, did a masterful job this offseason refortifying that offensive line. And they have something that they haven't had, Jacqueline, in the last couple of years: depth on the offensive line. And for a quarterback, that gives you so much confidence, because I felt like C.J. Stroud the last couple of years has been playing sped up. Right? When you don't have good protection up front, it speeds you up in progressions. Now that C.J. Stroud knows that he has a subsequent talent up front on the offensive line, and they've also put pieces in front of him to protect him, he'll be able to take his time to go through those progressions and find some of those young receivers on the outside.
Okay. Find some of those receivers on the outside. Couple things there. The pass protection and then the depth especially. I think there was a feeling of perhaps too much optimism during the regular season about the pass protection, because the sack numbers went down. And I think that's where CJ does deserve some credit. It's that if you look at the ESPN pass rush win rate and all those stats, the Texans offensive line was not as improved as the sack numbers and the pressure numbers would suggest. And I think that's because CJ did a better job of getting rid of the ball quickly. He did a good job of taking the easy money on first and second down, especially staying out of third and long situations. The pass protection did improve, and I think over the course of the season and year over year, it did improve. It still needs to get better. And that's where, when we get into the offensive line discussion and the draft and everything, we'll get into that. But I think that flat out CJ playing sped up the way that Leger was talking about, that the play that really sticks out in my mind was the Green Bay game from 2 years ago. So, yeah, I'm going back 2 years. But it was the perfect example at the end of the game when they were in field goal range already. They needed to be draining clock. And CJ ended up throwing a pass to Tank Dell that was incomplete, stopped the clock. If he had hung on to it a little bit longer, or if he had just gotten to his third read, he didn't even have to hang on to it that much longer. He had John Mechie wide open in the end zone. By that point in the game, CJ had been getting destroyed by porous pass protection. I excuse him in that situation, but it's one of those things that young quarterbacks deal with, is learning when and where to try to extend a play, when to go on and keep going through your progressions versus, all right, I'm hearing footsteps, or I'm imagining footsteps, and I'm going to get rid of the ball to Tank Dell, who, even if he had caught it, if my memory serves correctly, would have gone out of bounds. So they're already in field goal range. It was third down. At that point, you're better off taking a sack than throwing an incomplete pass or a pass that goes out of bounds that doesn't yield you a first down. The Tank Dell catch wouldn't have yielded him a first down. Those are the things that CJ has been dealing with, and I think he made a lot of progress in that last year. It's just he got to the playoffs and everything fell by the wayside. In terms of winning the AFC Championship, on FanDuel right now, the Texans are plus 1,000, 10-1 odds, basically, which I think those odds are a little bit better than they had been earlier. You guys fact check me on this, but Benjamin Solak, and speaking to kind of some of the struggles that Stroud has faced over the last few years, here's Solak on Stroud.
The thing for me is the Texans' running game, since Stroud has entered the league,
Brutal.
is 31st in EPA per rush and in terms of success rate. Only the Raiders are worse. So Stroud sees more third and longs per game than any quarterback starter over the last few years. It's him and Caleb Williams, the only two, to see like 7 third and longs per game. If you can, and Stroud in his rookie season saw tons of base defense, that's all down. He saw tons of single high, that's all down. If you can reintroduce a healthy rushing attack to Houston, Stroud will look more like the quarterback we expected him to be. So I'll take him here at 12.
Yeah, look, third and long is really, really hard for any quarterback, no matter who you are. You're Tom Brady in his prime, Pat Mahomes in his prime. I'm not sure he's still in his prime. That's a topic for another podcast. But the thing about Mahomes is, and Andy Reid and that offense in general, is even though their numbers have dropped off over the last couple of years, they're still really good at getting into third and manageable situations. And, you know, obviously with the Chiefs, you're not talking about doing it with a commitment to the run or anything. For most teams, and for the Texans especially, that is their methodology. That is their philosophy. They want to be able to use the run and be old school in a lot of ways to get those third and manageable situations. And when Solak talks about how defenses are kind of able to play the personnel they want to play, they can keep lighter bodies on the field because they don't have to commit big bodies to the run. And that makes it that much tougher to pass the ball when you want to pass the ball, or to take shot plays, because their teams are out there in nickel and dime, and they know they can stop the run without committing a lot of extra resources to it. To go back to something that Leger Duzabla said about depth on the offensive line, I meant to get to that after his clip. The depth on the offensive line, if you go back to that Patriots game, I'm going to continue to go back to that Patriots game, because we saw exactly what happens when you don't have good depth on the offensive line. When Trent Brown wasn't available for that game, they were not the same team that they were in Pittsburgh, and they were not able to run the ball at all against a similar defensive line to what the Steelers have on their defensive line. The Patriots did it better, but they had big, physical, tough guys playing odd fronts versus a 3-4 defense. The Texans had met that challenge the week before against Pittsburgh, and they were running the ball really effectively as the game wore on. And that just evaporated in a game in those weather conditions where, man, you really needed to be able to run the football, and they weren't able to. So the commitment to improving the run offense, the rushing offense this offseason, I think has been one of the most exciting things for me, because it looks like more of a playoff caliber football team. So the pass protection, yes, needs to continue to improve. Consistently running the football, I think they've made major inroads with that, and a lot of that starts with the personnel additions that they've made. Here is Emory Hunt on the 2 draft picks, and we'll kind of transition into the defensive side of this as well, because he's going to be talking about Keylan Rutledge and Kayden McDonald and how much he likes those guys.
Can you also say the Emory Hunt agenda is in full effect? How many times we said on this show, Ross, guard center guard play is more critical than tackle play, but also how many times have I spoken about the battery of a football team? Center, nose tackle, Mike backer, free safety, quarterback, running back, right? So the Houston Texans subscribe to the Emory Hunt agenda because they got my number 5 guard. Now that we know all these guards went in round 1, and they got my number 1 nose tackle in Kayden McDonald, who I was a superior fan of, and I thought he would have a chance to go in round 1 to the Minnesota Vikings, but they went with another defensive tackle, another good one at that, in Caleb Banks. But love these 2 picks. Point of attack play is where you win football games. They got 2 studs right out of the gate.
Okay, so point of attack play. I love that Emory talked about this. There's an old theory in sports about the center line, how important it is to have tough, smart players in the center line in baseball. Your catcher, your pitcher, your center fielder, your shortstop, if you want to include him in that. Like all of these things, this is where the decisions are made. This is where the dirty business happens. In football, it tends to go a little bit more caveman, and you're talking about the tough and gritty part of football. And the Texans are pretty well taken care of on the perimeters of both the offense and the defense. You've got Nico Collins. I'm excited about Jaden Higgins. If Tank Dell comes back and it looks great, oh my gosh, I'm going to be besides myself with joy. On the defensive side of the ball, you've got your edge rushers. You've got your cornerbacks. Awesome. So you go to the center of everything. And last year, where were the Texans struggling, especially when it came to playing in cold weather up north. They had a revolving door at one of the safety positions. Azeez Al-Shaair, awesome. No problems with him. Defensive tackle, when it came to stopping the run, they didn't necessarily have the body type guys like Kayden McDonald. Naquan Jones is interesting to me, and he's a big body dude, but they didn't feel awesome about that right up the center line when you're talking about stopping the run. Interior offensive line, my God, I can't even talk about it. But that's the huge challenge this year, is being tough and physical with the interior offensive line. So when you face defenses like the Patriots, do you have answers? And then David Montgomery, obviously. Tough, nasty, gritty, physical guy that hopefully can give you that physical presence. Woody Marks can end up being used more on the perimeter, in the passing game, all of those things. They did a good job of just bolstering the center line of the defense. The Texans right now are plus 900, so 9-1 to be the number 1 seed in the AFC. I know it's slightly different than winning the AFC, being the number 1 seed. One is a regular season stat, but I would prefer to not have to deal with playing in cold weather and bad weather. Yeah, even if I were a northern team, I don't like the elements making a football game random the way the elements tend to do that. And I think that what they did with at least attempting to right now, bolster the interior offensive line, adding that massive physical presence in the defensive tackle side of things, that's the right strategy. That's January football. That's ideally getting on into February football. And then you're also more capable to, aside from whether it's weather conditions or being on the road or anything else like that, you've just got more answers for different teams of varying degrees of abilities. So whatever your matchups are, they did a good job of addressing all of those things. The big plays on defense, if we talk about an awesome defense for the Texans, but where could they improve? There were too many explosives at times in stretches with the Texans defense last year. And I'm always, I'm walking very carefully here, because I don't want anybody to think that I'm overly criticizing the defense when the defense by far is the star pupil of that football team. But I'll let Azeez Al-Shaair do it for you. So Azeez Al-Shaair, talking with Sean Pendergast on Sports Radio 610 a couple weeks ago, talked about where they need to improve defensively.
I think there's a couple things. Some explosives, like eliminating explosives, eliminating some of the points that we gave up, because there was different spurts throughout the year. Throughout the whole season, we were doing really well. But even the last, I want to say 3 games that Burke showed, the last 3 games, we ended up finishing in points per game 0.2 behind Seattle, I want to say. But in the last 3 games, regardless of who was in there, who wasn't in there, we gave up 30 points one time.
Indy.
Yeah.
In week 18.
30 points to Indy in week 18. To think you got 30 points in the last game of the season, it's that right there. And you lose, and mind you give up 30 points the last game of the season and you lose the points per game by 0.2%.
Yeah, and look, we know that, and it's fun because that Indy game, you could say, hey, Kamari Lassiter was out. They didn't play the starters in the second half. Before they rested all their starters, it was still not as good as you want it to be versus Riley Leonard and the Indianapolis Colts in that game, obviously. And the defense certainly played well enough to advance in the playoffs in both games. But that Patriots game, I think the standard the Texans have on defense is, look, if the offense can score a touchdown, let's win that football game. And it was the big plays. It was some of the chunk plays in that game that ultimately did them in. They have that standard for themselves. And I think it's fair with all of their starters returning and then adding on to it with Blankenship, with Kayden McDonald. I think there's a chance that awesome defense from last year could be even better this year by just being, in some degrees, more consistent. I would say smarter on the back end at times. And a lot of that, again, goes back to that safety position, and having Reed Blankenship is just a steady guy back there. If you can start the entire season, that's way more. That is light years beyond what they had for all of last season, where you had 5 or 6 different guys playing safety opposite of Kalen Bullock. So I think that part of it, and then, some of the standards, the things they already do is they showed up, and Will Anderson showed up in the playoffs. The 2 strip sacks, multiple hits on QB, awesome performance by Will Anderson, Danielle Hunter. They did everything that you need to do. They just have a higher standard for themselves, and they want to be that high. Matt Burke, when he opened up I remember he told the story about his first team meeting last year with the defense, and he was setting a standard of, hey, these are the best scoring defenses of all time. Look at this. This is how many the Ravens back in the day, the Steelers back in the day, this is how many points per game they allowed, and put up some pretty stellar numbers. I don't know how achievable some of those numbers from the old days are given the offensive explosion, but some of those teams were holding offenses to 10 points per game or 11 points per game. It was absurd how good they were. Times have changed. The rule books have changed a lot, but being the number one scoring defense and missing out by 0.2 points per game, it's something that's sticking in those guys' craw, and they're upset about it. So I'm excited about that part of it. The last thing, if we've talked about just the offensive line and pass protection in general, B, the run game specifically, this all, still circles CJ and what he can, what he is capable of doing if he's in the right environment. I'm not trying to make excuses for CJ. It's just that's the reality of the situation. The toughness and the grittiness in the middle of the offense and in the middle of the defense, I think that might have been kind of a sneaky, sly overall biggest thing they needed to do to really ascend into a different tier of football teams. And I think they've made a lot of aggressive moves in doing that, but a couple things need to happen. Wyatt Teller needs to stay healthy and be the guy that he's capable of being, but he's also older. If he's not capable of doing that, then you need Keylan Rutledge to really step up to the plate and be a viable starting guard, perhaps earlier than later. Or Keylan Rutledge needs to show up and just, man, wow, look at this. You can play center. It's not always a given that you can just jump right in and play a position that you've hardly ever played before. Rutledge has a few snaps at the Senior Bowl. There's a lot that goes into being a center. Ed Ingram needs to improve in his pass protection somewhat, but the theme of the offseason and running the ball on the interior, he's one of the best guys in the league when it comes to that. One of Ed Ingram's biggest flaws in pass protection is linked to what makes him so good as a run defender. He's nasty. And sometimes he goes on the attack more than he should in pass protection. So there's times where I think he needs to learn when to back off a little bit, especially when you're going against the Chris Jones of the worlds and whatnot. But then David Montgomery on the defensive side of the ball, Kayden McDonald needs to work out. Going back to David Montgomery, they need to still potentially bolster the running back depth. I'm not over the moon right now about the running back depth. I'm intrigued by Jawar Jordan. I'm intrigued by British Brooks, but I'd like to see more. I'm intrigued by a couple of the Whittington, the undrafted rookie free agent. I'm intrigued by him, but if we're just looking at it on paper right now, I still need either one of those guys to really, really emerge, or maybe they bring somebody in from without. And then, of course, Blankenship on the other side of the ball. I think they've done those things to address being a January football team, more so than they had in the past. So if we move away from the players, then it really comes down to, all right, the coaching. So there's DeMeco, there's Nick Caley, there's Jerry Shaplinsky, there's all of these things. And here's Azeez Al-Shaair on DeMeco Ryans and what he told them after that Colts game. Because I feel like people sometimes think that DeMeco is happy, joy all the time, when in fact, he really, if you hear Azeez talk about DeMeco and the way he coaches, Azeez will talk about how DeMeco knows how to just make it really, really difficult all the time. And that's the side of DeMeco I think that I've seen and I know and I understand that people wouldn't necessarily see in the press conferences. And because he's not shouting and screaming and dog cussing guys on the sideline, they don't realize just how hard he coaches these guys. This was Azeez telling Sean Pendergast what DeMeco told them after that disappointing defensive performance against the Colts.
At the end, he's like, okay, since y'all clearly are buying into the hype of who y'all think y'all supposed to be, let me show y'all what y'all have done. Because if y'all the number one defense and y'all just played and gave up 30 points to the Colts in week 18 when they have a game that they have nothing to play for at this point.
With a rookie quarterback.
You know what I'm saying? And
yeah.
honestly, I respect every player that plays.
Sure.
So, but still, 100%. Like, there's so many things that you could sit there outside looking in and be like, oh man, it should be a cakewalk. And none of us were thinking that. But at the same time, it's like, the plays that we gave up in that game, a lot of them weren't even like something crazy. It was just stuff that we weren't doing.
Yeah, and again, going back to the standard that they have on defense, obviously that wasn't up to their standards. Good job by Azeez not biting on shock jock Sean Pendergast's attempt to talk smack about Riley Leonard. I would add that to the mix of things that the defense probably watched some cut-ups of so far in the spring is the scrambling quarterback. So whether it's Riley Leonard, Bo Nix, Baker Mayfield, Trevor Lawrence gave him some scary moments with his legs. Those critical moments in the fourth quarter of some of those games where quarterbacks were able to, really hurt them or keep them in the game. Baker Mayfield, it's 4th and 10. All you got to do is bottle up Baker Mayfield, get him on the ground at 9 yards past the line of scrimmage, and they weren't able to do it just because of breakdown and leverage and discipline and all of those things. Just these few little glitches here and there. I think that's probably going to be one of the big emphasis is going on into this training camp and this season. Best game they did all last year versus that was Josh Allen. They utilized a spy really effectively. They did a lot of things to make Josh Allen's legs way less effective than they're capable of being. And they get to do it again this year, hopefully in NRG Stadium. The other thing with DeMeco on the coaching side of things, one is it feels like the game management at times hasn't been as good as his rookie year as a coach, when we were really, really impressed with the game management side of things and some of the clock management. It hasn't been as good, and there have been more glitches in the last couple of years. And that's something that when it comes to the overall process, especially when you're working with young offensive coordinators like Nick Caley or Bobby Slowick, that I think they need to be more on top of. Nick Caley himself, I think, learned some lessons as a rookie offensive coordinator. I think the kind of the welcome to the NFL moment for him as a coordinator was probably last year, where I suspect that they were planning on going into this season being a real tight end heavy offense, as is the trend in the NFL right now. And he's coming out of LA, where LA's doing that a boatload now, using 3 tight ends. So I think Nick Caley was full bore into that. The problem was that 2 of the top 3 tight ends went on IR within 2 weeks of the start of the season, and you kind of got to scramble after that. And it's his responsibility to scramble better than he did, but they kind of bided their time. They figured out what did and didn't work. If you look at the offseason, it's one of the things I should have mentioned earlier that I was excited about is that, okay, they pretty aggressively addressed the tight end position. Now, with numbers at least, bringing in Moreau, who's a good blocker, whether you want to call it drafting Marlon Klein or reaching for Marlon Klein, whatever it might be, I think they think he has a lot of upside to be a physical inline blocker. I know DeMeco will remind everybody that they think he's got a lot of potential as a receiver too. But I think that's where it could really work out for him, is if Marlon Klein can end up being a good blocker. And I don't know if that happens this year or next year. Marlon Klein did some really good things as a blocker in college, shows a lot of tenacity, shows a lot of that, hey, I'm going to get after you, like a George Kittle type of mentality. I'm not saying he's a George Kittle-like player, but that George Kittle type mentality, he's just got to clean up his technique. A lot of his really good blocks in college definitely would have gotten flagged in the NFL because he's just grabbing guys, and there's just some things that he's got to clean up in terms of that. But that's typical for any rookie coming in. So the tight ends and how much Nick Caley can perhaps make this offense look more like what he wants to look like. Yes, 100%. The other big, it was kind of a big storyline, I suppose, but Dra Johnson leaves the Texans. He had been CJ's quarterback's coach, but at least, by name and position title. Jerry Shaplinski, who's now the quarterback's coach, has been working pretty closely with CJ Stroud. And this was from mic'd up during practice last year. CJ Stroud talking to Jerry Shaplinski.
That's all football is playing catch.
Nothing more, nothing less. That's a great example. Don't try to overdo when things get tough. Just do what you're supposed to do.
I'll learn my lessons, brother. Thanks, baby.
Great job by CK. Great spot.
Yeah. I think I like that. We just got to be on the same.
We can snap it down, treat it like.
We just got to be on the same page.
That way you still have a throw.
Yeah, so look, nothing earth-shattering there other than, okay, you can tell they have a good rapport. I think CJ saying, hey, it's just playing catch. It sounds like he's reiterating something that he's been told either by Shaplinsky or other people, where there's a tendency. And I think sometimes quarterbacks in the NFL are almost sometimes victims of all the propaganda that gets thrown at them about how it's going to be so hard and you got to be brilliant. You got to be like Peyton Manning out there. There's a balance. Sometimes just don't overthink about it. Don't overthink it. The old saying that I think Andy Reid would use is that you're not laying bricks, you're painting a canvas. Don't be out there just trying to think that, there's this process and I have to follow the process and that there's a little bit of just remember to always play by feel. And don't try too hard. Be like an artist. Wake up late, not literally, but to be a little bit more laid back about it. And quarterbacks are always trying to find that balance in between where they need to be and when were they too conservative? When were they too aggressive? When did you get rid of the ball too quickly? You should have held on to it. Why are you holding on to the ball so long, you idiot? It's hard, man. I would have been even if I had the physical skill set to be a quarterback, I know that I don't have the mental makeup. Far too reactionary. I'd be flipping out about every little thing. I'd go into a funk. I'd be a mess. I openly concede that, but I will openly criticize quarterbacks because that's what they get paid to do. Damn it. This is the Believe in Texans podcast, brought to you by FanDuel. I appreciate everybody for watching or listening. If you're watching on YouTube, please like and subscribe. If you're listening on Apple, Spotify, wherever you're listening, please subscribe, leave a review, and some nice comments. That would be awesome. Everybody have a great one.